Adrian Keller thought he could have it all. Lena Moore believed in a love that was too good to be true, and Clara Keller never imagined her quiet suspicion would lead to the ultimate downfall. In a tale of obsession, betrayal, and shattered illusions, one man's reckless desire ignited a chain of events no one could escape. Adrian Keller's life looked perfect from the outside. He was a well-dressed man, admired for his confidence and success. To his colleagues, he was a businessman, with endless opportunities, a man who always had somewhere important to be. But when he started making frequent trips to Muse, a small city known for its cobblestone streets and riverside charm, those closest to him didn't question his motives. They believed his explanation that Muse was becoming a growing market for his company, and he wanted to invest before others caught on. What no one knew was that business was only a cover. The real reason Adrian rushed to Muse so often was far more personal. In a tucked-away corner of the city, far from the glossy tourist squares, sat a small art gallery. It didn't have the prestige of the larger ones, but it carried an intimacy that appealed to the locals. This gallery belonged to Lena, a young painter with striking features and a quiet determination. Her work was emotional and raw, often reflecting her own longing for connection. Adrian first met her at one of her evening exhibitions. He walked in out of curiosity, but the moment he saw her, he felt something he couldn't explain. The way she spoke about her art, the way her eyes glowed when she described a brushstroke, pulled him in. That night marked the beginning of a secret life that would spiral beyond his control. At first, Adrian justified his visits as harmless. A man of his position was entitled to distractions, he told himself. He convinced his mind that Lena was simply inspiration, a breath of fresh air after years of routine. But every trip to Muse tightened the bond between them. He began to crave her presence, to plan his days around stolen hours in her gallery. The quiet afternoons when he stood beside her, listening as she painted, felt more real than the polished dinners he shared with his wife back home. Muse to Adrian became a sanctuary, where responsibility didn't exist. Yet the affair wasn't as discreet as he imagined. Neighbors in Muse noticed the foreign businessman who lingered too long in the small gallery. Some whispered about the way Lena's laughter carried across the street when Adrian was around. Others noticed the sudden surge in her confidence, as though she had discovered a secret power. Adrian never considered that a town so small could hold so many watchful eyes. In his mind, Muse was untouchable, a safe world separate from his reality. For Lena, Adrian was more than a lover. He represented escape. She saw in him the chance to break free from her modest life and find stability. His tailored suits, his expensive watch, his promises of support, all of it painted a picture of a future she had always imagined. She allowed herself to believe his words, ignoring the fact that he still had a wife waiting elsewhere. The affair gave her hope, but hope can be dangerous when built on secrets. Each visit became riskier, each moment more reckless. Adrian didn't notice how his double life began to unravel in small invisible ways. Receipts left in his car, calls unanswered at home, hours unaccounted for. Clues began to pile up like shadows waiting to reveal themselves, and while Adrian convinced himself that Muse was his paradise, the truth was far darker. What began as a secret passion would soon ignite the kind of storm that neither he nor Lena could escape. Clara Keller had always trusted her instincts. She was the kind of woman who noticed the smallest details, the slight hesitation in a tone of voice, the faint smell of cologne that lingered too long, the way her husband's eyes seemed to be somewhere else even when he sat across from her at dinner. For years she had lived in the comfort of a stable marriage, believing her loyalty and effort had created an unshakable bond. But now there was a distance she couldn't ignore. Adrian was gone more often than not, and when he was home, he seemed distracted, as if his body sat at the table but his heart resided elsewhere. At first, Clara blamed it on work stress. Business could be demanding, and Adrian was known for throwing himself into his project. Yet deep down, something felt off. Her observations soon sharpened into suspicion. Receipts, tucked carelessly in Adrian's jacket pocket, revealed dinners for two, not business meetings. Hotel stays extended a day longer than he claimed, phone calls ended abruptly when she entered the room, and messages came in late at night with names she didn't recognize. None of these things alone would have proved anything, but together, they painted a picture she struggled to deny. She was a woman caught between loyalty and reality, torn between wanting to protect her marriage and wanting to confront the truth. Clara began keeping a quiet record. Dates, times, little notes of discrepancies, all gathered in her private journal. She didn't confront Adrian, not yet. She wanted certainty, not suspicion. If he had chosen to betray her, she would need to be prepared. She knew from her upbringing in a powerful family that acting without evidence could leave her vulnerable, and Clara never allowed herself to be vulnerable. At night she would lie awake beside Adrian, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, wondering if he was dreaming of her or of someone else. The bed felt colder, the silence heavier. Every laugh he shared on the phone behind closed doors echoed in her ears long after he hung up. Slowly, the pain of betrayal turned into something sharper. She felt humiliated, not because he might be unfaithful, but because he seemed to believe she would never notice. Clara's silence grew dangerous. Adrian mistook it for ignorance, believing his cover story remained intact. In reality, she was watching him unravel piece by piece, waiting for the moment when his lies would collapse under their own weight. What Adrian didn't realize was that the woman he thought he could deceive so easily had already begun planning her next move. The betrayal she suspected wasn't just breaking her heart, it was shaping her into an adversary he could never have anticipated. Adrian Keller had always been reckless with his words. But with Lena, his recklessness took on a dangerous edge. In Muse, away from the routines and responsibilities of his marriage, he felt untouchable. Each time Lena pressed him for answers about their future, he gave her promises that grew heavier with every trip. At first, they were vague and harmless. Talk of spending more time together, of supporting her art, of taking her away on small getaways. But soon Lena began to demand more than stolen afternoons and whispered assurances. She wanted permanence. She wanted him to choose. For Adrian, the thrill of secrecy was intoxicating. He felt alive in Lena's presence in a way he hadn't in years. When she looked at him, he saw admiration, desire, and dependence. It was everything his marriage no longer provided. Yet Lena's longing began to turn into frustration. She was tired of waiting, tired of existing only in the shadow of his double life. She started pressing him harder, asking when he would leave his wife, when he would make good on the promises he hinted at. Adrian, desperate to keep her close and terrified of losing her, gave her the words she wanted to hear. He swore he would divorce Clara. He told her the life they dreamed of together was within reach. He promised it would happen soon. The promise, however, was more dangerous than Adrian realized. Once spoken, it became real to Lena. She clung to it, built her hopes around it, and saw her future reshaping itself. Every painting she created seemed brighter. Every day felt like a step closer to freedom. She believed him, and in believing, she bound herself more tightly to him. But promises are not as easy to keep as they are to make, and Adrian's words carried consequences he hadn't calculated. Back home, Clara continued to observe his behavior with quiet determination. Adrian didn't notice the changes in her demeanor, the way she no longer sought his affection, the way her conversations with him grew colder and more detached. He was too focused on keeping Lena satisfied, too busy crafting lies to cover the growing cracks. He convinced himself he could control both worlds, that Clara would remain silent, and Lena would remain patient. What he didn't realize was that both women were moving in directions he couldn't stop. Meanwhile, the strain of his double life began to show in subtle ways. Business meetings were forgotten, phone calls unanswered, his focus drifting at times when it mattered most. His colleagues whispered about his distraction, wondering if he was hiding a professional mistake. Adrian brushed off their concerns, but the truth was simple. He had entangled himself in promises he couldn't keep. In Muse, Lena started making plans as though the divorce was inevitable. She imagined where they would live, how she would travel with him, how their lives would look once his marriage ended. In her mind, the story had already been written. For Adrian, however, the promise was little more than a shield, a way to delay her demands and hold on to the illusion of control. But illusions eventually shatter, and with every promise he gave, the clock began to tick faster toward a collision that neither love nor lies could prevent. When Clara finally uncovered undeniable proof of Adrian's betrayal, it didn't arrive as a sudden revelation, but rather as the culmination of weeks of silent observation. The evidence was in her hands, a series of photographs sent anonymously to her email. Adrian and Lena together, walking the narrow streets of Muse, his arm draped across her shoulders, his expression careless and unguarded. For Clara, it wasn't just the image of her husband with another woman that cut deepest. It was the ease with which he had allowed himself to be captured, the arrogance of believing he could hide something so reckless. In that instant, her suspicion transformed into certainty, and certainty gave way to a rage that simmered beneath the surface. In private, she studied the photographs over and over, not out of grief, but to transform her pain into clarity. She traced the smile on Adrian's face, the way Lena looked at him, and she felt her humiliation settle into determination. If Adrian had chosen to live a double life, she would not simply leave quietly, she would dismantle everything he depended on, piece by piece. Meanwhile, she watched Adrian stumble through his lies, oblivious to the trap tightening around him. He thought he was clever, that his business trips to Muse were still hidden from her, but Clara's silence was more dangerous than any confrontation. She no longer needed him to confess. She already had the truth, and with that truth, she intended to strip him of everything he valued. At night she no longer lay awake in despair. Instead she felt a strange calm. The humiliation that once burned her now fueled her resolve. Adrian had chosen Lena over her, chosen deception over loyalty, but Clara would ensure that his betrayal came at a cost he could never have imagined. The affair no longer represented a broken marriage. It marked the beginning of Adrian Keller's undoing. The morning Adrian was served with divorce papers, he was caught completely off guard. He had returned from Muse only a day earlier, carrying with him the afterglow of Lena's affection and the reassurance of his own lies. He believed, foolishly, that Clara remained in the dark, that her silence was proof of her ignorance. But as he opened the envelope and read the words written in cold legal language, his composure cracked. Clara had moved first. She wasn't pleading, she wasn't accusing, she was ending everything. The strike was swift and clean, and in that moment Adrian realized he had underestimated the woman he had taken for granted. The divorce papers were more than a personal blow. They carried devastating financial consequences. Adrian's business empire, which had been built on years of strategic deals and careful investments, leaned heavily on Clara's family connections. Contracts, partnerships, even lines of credit had been secured through her influence. Without her, his standing in the corporate world was fragile. The lawyer's words made it clear. Clara wasn't just leaving him, she was dismantling him. Everything he had believed untouchable was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Panic consumed him. Adrian rushed back to Muse, desperate for Lena's comfort. He needed her more than ever, imagining she would embrace him, reassure him, and give him purpose now that Clara had turned against him. Muse had always been his escape, the place where reality felt distant, but when he arrived at Lena's gallery, the atmosphere felt different. The warmth he had come to rely on was missing. Lena listened to him speak, her eyes narrowing as he confessed his troubles. She had once begged him to leave Clara, but now that he stood before her as a man on the verge of ruin, her enthusiasm faltered. Lena had imagined Adrian's divorce as a liberation, the final proof of his devotion to her. She pictured a man who would sweep her into a new life, bringing with him the wealth and stability she had long desired. Instead, what she saw was desperation. Adrian's charm was fading, replaced with panic. His expensive suits suddenly looked like costumes masking decay. She realized that what had drawn her in, the power, the control, the confidence, was slipping away. And with it her feelings began to unravel. For Adrian, This shift was devastating. He had believed Lena's love was unwavering, that she would cling to him as he fell. But in her silence, in her distant gaze, he saw the truth. The foundation of their affair had always been fragile, built not on loyalty but on illusions. The more he begged, the colder she became. She no longer wanted to be tethered to a man sinking into chaos. Adrian left the gallery that night hollow, carrying with him the weight of both betrayals. Clara had cut him loose, and Lena, the woman for whom he had risked everything, was already pulling away. His once carefully balanced life had shattered in a matter of days. The promise of control he clung to was gone, and the man who had once thrived on power now stood on the edge of collapse, with no one willing to catch him. Lena had always believed Adrian represented possibility. When he first entered her gallery, she saw more than a wealthy businessman. She saw a man who could lift her out of obscurity, a man whose presence validated her worth. Every promise he made was stitched into the fabric of her dreams. She waited for the day he would choose her openly, leaving behind the life he claimed had grown stale. But when Adrian finally returned to Muse after being served divorce papers, something about him had changed. The man who once exuded control and confidence now carried himself with the weight of defeat. His suit was pressed, but his shoulders slumped. His words came quickly, laced with desperation, and the sparkle that had once drawn her in was replaced with panic. At first, Lena listened, trying to understand. She had pushed him for months to end things with Clara, and now he was standing in front of her, saying it had happened. But instead of joy, she felt unease. His divorce was not the triumph she had imagined. It was a collapse. Adrian wasn't the strong, decisive man she had admired. He was broken, a man pleading for comfort, for reassurance, for something she was no longer certain she wanted to give. He spoke of betrayal, of being left with nothing, of Clara stripping him of his fortune. His voice cracked under the weight of humiliation. In his fall, Lena saw the truth she had ignored for too long. Her love for him was ridiculous. She began to see him differently. His wealth, once so dazzling, had been tied to Clara. His power, once so intoxicating, had been borrowed from connections he no longer possessed. Without those things, Adrian was just another man, flawed, weak, and now unwanted. Lena had dreamed of galleries in new cities, of traveling with him, of a future built on his resources. But with those resources gone, the fantasy dissolved. She had mistaken lust and ambition for love, and now that illusion shattered before her eyes. Adrian didn't recognize the shift in her at first. He still believed she was his safe haven, the person who would understand him when no one else did. He leaned on her, calling her endlessly, showing up at the gallery with gifts he could no longer afford, promising that they could rebuild together. But Lena's patience thinned. Each gesture only reminded her of what he had lost. She grew colder, distancing herself not out of cruelty but out of self-preservation. The man she had once admired now drained her, dragging her into a storm she wanted no part of. In Muse, whispers began to spread. Locals who had once envied Lena's connection to Adrian now saw him as a fallen man, wandering the streets with hollow eyes. Some pitied him, others mocked his downfall. Adrian, blinded by his need, didn't see the inevitability of her withdrawal. He still believed love could hold them together, that Lena would remain loyal even as everything else collapsed. But Lena was already gone in spirit, her heart detached long before her words made it clear. What remained between them was nothing but a shell, an illusion that had finally lost all meaning. Adrian had avoided Clara for weeks, hoping that the divorce papers were some sort of bluff, a tactic meant to frighten him into ending his affair. But the silence between them grew heavier, and the legal documents stacked on his desk reminded him that this was not a game. Clara was serious, and she had the power to dismantle everything he had built. Finally, cornered and desperate, he decided to confront her. He told himself he could reason with her, that their years together meant something, that he could appeal to the bond they once shared. But when he stood in front of Clara, he realized he was no longer the man who held control in the relationship. The balance of power had shifted entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but sharp enough to cut through his desperation. She reminded him that their marriage had not just been about affection, it had been a partnership, a network of influence and trust that had taken years to cultivate. She told him that while he was chasing illusions in Muse, she had already secured her future without him. The divorce was not only final, it was devastating. She had worked with her lawyers and her family's connections to ensure that nearly everything Adrian valued would be stripped from him. His company was crumbling, his reputation stained, and his access to the wealth he flaunted had been severed. For Adrian, the realization was crushing. He had believed Clara would fight to keep him, that her love and pride would prevent her from letting go. Instead, she had outplayed him. The woman he thought he could deceive had turned out to be far stronger than he imagined. She hadn't begged, she hadn't cried, she had dismantled him with precision. Adrian begged her then, dropping the last of his pride. He asked her to remember their years together, to consider forgiveness, to give him one more chance. But Clara's silence was colder than rejection. When she finally looked him in the eye, she told him it was already too late. The conversation ended not with a fight, but with finality. Adrian walked out of the house he once called his own, feeling the weight of defeat settle into his bones. Clara had taken everything he thought defined him, and Lena had already begun to drift away. What remained was emptiness. The man who once controlled 2 lives now controlled nothing at all. Adrian returned to Muse as though the city itself might offer him some form of redemption. It was late autumn, and the cobblestone streets were slick with rain, their glow reflecting the dim lights of shops closing for the evening. He walked aimlessly, clutching a half-empty bottle, his thoughts scattered and heavy. The man who once strode through these same streets with confidence now staggered, his tailored coat soaked, his eyes red from sleepless nights. He had lost everything, his wife, his fortune, his reputation, and now he feared he was losing Lena as well. That night, as he stood under the flickering street lamp, he collapsed. His body gave out, worn down by stress, alcohol, and despair. Passers-by found him lying motionless on the cold stone, his once polished shoes scuffed, his breath shallow. Whispers spread quickly through Muse. The businessman from abroad, the man who had once turned heads with his wealth and charm, had fallen. Some residents rushed to help, while others watched from a distance, shaking their heads at the downfall of someone who seemed untouchable. News of Adrian's collapse reached Clara, but she did not flinch. To her, this was the inevitable end of a man who believed he could live without consequence. Lena, on the other hand, avoided the gallery for several days, unable to face the gossip swirling around her name. Adrian survived the collapse, but survival offered no relief. He awoke in a small hospital ward, stripped of dignity, his future uncertain. The doctors spoke of exhaustion, of a body pushed beyond its limits, but Adrian knew the truth. It was not just his body that had failed, it was the life he had built on deception and arrogance. He had gambled on love, on control, on the illusion of invincibility, and in the end, he had lost it all. Muse, once his escape, became his graveyard of illusions. The city remembered him not as the powerful man who arrived with wealth and promises, but as the broken figure who collapsed outside a gallery, undone by his own choices. His story spread as a cautionary tale, a reminder that desire, betrayal, and pride could destroy even the strongest facade. Adrian Keller had rushed to Muse chasing a love that was never real, and in the end, it left him with nothing but ruin.